When we ask the question, how does a child become a narcissist? We are not talking about a child who is born bad or selfish. We are talking about a child who, over time, learns certain survival strategies in response to their environment. Children are naturally authentic. They feel joy, sadness, curiosity, fear, and they look to their caregivers for validation and safety. But when that validation is absent, inconsistent, or conditional, the child adapts. And those adaptations can lay the groundwork for narcissistic traits later in life. For example, imagine a child who is constantly criticized, compared to siblings, or made to feel never enough. That child begins to internalize shame. Instead of learning, I am valued for who I am, the child thinks, I must perform, achieve, or be perfect to earn love. Over time, the true self retreats and a mask develops. On the other end of the spectrum, a child who is excessively praised only for achievements or idealized beyond reality may also develop distorted views of self-worth. They may feel pressure to always be special or superior because their sense of identity depends entirely on external validation. In both cases, the child's authentic emotional needs, love, safety, acceptance, go unmet. So the child creates a false self-confident, charming, even grandiose. But beneath that surface lies deep insecurity and fear of rejection. It's important to remember, narcissism doesn't grow from healthy self-love. It grows when a child feels unseen, unsafe, or unloved in their authenticity. The behaviors we later call narcissistic are, at their root, survival strategies. Understanding this helps us move away from blame and toward compassion, because behind every narcissistic pattern is often a child who once learned that being real was not safe, and that love had to be earned, not given freely. When we look at how a child develops into the adult they eventually become, one of the most important and yet overlooked factors is the early environment in which they grow. A child does not develop in isolation. They are shaped every day by the relationships, experiences, and emotional climate that surrounds them. Personality is not something that simply appears overnight. It is formed gradually, like clay being molded. And the hands that shape it most powerfully are those of the child's caregivers and immediate environment. Think about how a child first learns who they are. Before they even have words to describe themselves, they look into the eyes of their parents, their guardians, and those around them. In those reflections, they begin to understand, am I safe? Am I loved? Do I matter? When those reflections are warm, consistent, and nurturing, the child begins to internalize a sense of stability and worth. They feel they can explore the world, make mistakes, and still be loved. That is the foundation for a healthy and balanced personality. But when the environment is unpredictable, harsh, neglectful, or conditional, the child learns something very different. Instead of safety, they sense danger. Instead of unconditional love, they experience love that has strings attached. They may learn that affection only comes when they succeed, when they are quiet, when they perform, or when they meet a certain expectation. This creates a deep conflict. The child's authentic self may want to laugh, play, or express fear. But the environment teaches them that authenticity is not always safe. This is where adaptation begins. The early environment pushes the child to trade authenticity for survival. If a child learns that showing sadness results in being ignored, they may suppress sadness. If they notice that achievements bring praise while vulnerability brings criticism, they begin to lean more heavily on performance as a way of getting needs met. Over time, these adaptations start to shape the building blocks of personality. The child learns to hide parts of themselves that are not accepted and amplify the parts that gain approval. It's important to understand that children are incredibly resilient and incredibly observant. They quickly pick up on the emotional rules of the household. If anger fills the air every time a mistake is made, the child may internalize fear and overcorrect by trying to appear flawless. If the household operates on comparison, where one child is praised for being better, smarter, or stronger, the child may adopt competitiveness or defensiveness as a way of protecting themselves. All of this is learned in the earliest years, long before the child has the words to explain what is happening to them. The emotional environment also dictates whether a child learns self-acceptance or self-doubt. A nurturing environment allows mistakes to be teaching moments. It communicates that imperfection does not erase worth. A harsh environment, however, teaches the opposite. It teaches that worth is fragile, dependent on external factors, and easily lost. From this, a child begins to carry an inner narrative that says, "I am not enough unless I prove it," or "I must hide who I really am to be safe." These narratives are powerful and often stay with them into adulthood. We cannot separate the adult personality from the child's environment. The confident adult who seems self-assured often grew up in a place where self-expression was welcome. The anxious or defensive adult may have been raised in an environment where trust and acceptance were inconsistent. And in the case of narcissistic traits, what we are often seeing is the long-term effect of a child who adapted to an early environment that did not meet their emotional needs. The environment essentially forced them to create a shield, a version of themselves that could protect them from shame, rejection, or fear. This is why the early years matter so profoundly. Every glance, every word, every response from a caregiver sends a message to the child about who they are and whether the world is safe. These messages are not forgotten. They sink deep into the developing personality and create patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that may last a lifetime. A child who receives consistency, warmth, and acceptance builds a foundation of inner strength. A child who receives criticism, neglect, or conditional love learns to survive in ways that may not serve them well later. When we look at personality through this lens, it becomes clear that early environment is not just a backdrop. It is the blueprint. The way a child is treated the atmosphere of the home, the emotional availability of caregivers. All of these factors shape the child's self-image, their coping strategies, and ultimately, the way they relate to others in adulthood. This is why understanding the role of early environment is essential. It helps us see that narcissistic traits or any other personality patterns are not random. They are learned, adapted, and shaped by the earliest emotional experiences. Parenting style is one of the most powerful influences on how a child develops because it determines how love, acceptance, and discipline are expressed in the home. Children are naturally dependent on their caregivers, not just for food and shelter, but for a sense of emotional safety. They learn who they are and how they fit into the world based on how their parents respond to them. When love is consistent, unconditional, and steady, the child grows with a sense of worth that is not easily shaken. But when love is conditional, given only when certain expectations are met, the child learns that acceptance is something to be earned, not something freely available. This conditionality becomes a core theme in their personality. Imagine a child who only receives warmth or attention when they bring home perfect grades. The underlying message is clear. You are valuable when you achieve, but not when you fail. Another child may notice that praise and affection come when they behave obediently, but criticism or withdrawal of love follows if they express anger, sadness, or individuality. Over time, the child learns to shape themselves into whatever earns approval, suppressing the parts of their identity that might risk rejection. While this adaptation helps them survive emotionally in childhood, it can create long-term consequences. They begin to believe that their real self is unworthy, and only the version that pleases others deserves love. Conditional love often takes subtle forms as well. It might not always look like harsh punishment or overt rejection. Sometimes it appears as emotional distance, when a child does not meet expectations, or as comparison to others. Why can't you be more like your brother? Why can't you be the top of the class? These repeated experiences tell the child that who they are in their natural state is insufficient. They must constantly strive, perform, or compete to hold on to affection. The result is a fragile self-esteem built not on intrinsic worth, but on external achievement and approval. This fragile self-esteem can be a breeding ground for narcissistic traits. The child, feeling that their true self is never enough, begins to rely heavily on the false self, the mask of competence, perfection, or superiority. They may grow to believe that only by excelling, impressing, or standing out can they be valued. Underneath, however, remains the child who fears being unworthy if they cannot keep up the performance. This dynamic is not born out of malice on the child's part, but as a direct response to the conditional love they experienced. On the other hand, overindulgent parenting can create a different, but equally problematic version of conditional love. When a child is excessively praised, idealized, or told they are superior without grounding in reality, They may come to associate love with being special or exceptional. While this may sound like unconditional praise, it is still conditional at its core. The child learns that their worth comes from standing out, not from simply being themselves. If they are not constantly celebrated or admired, they may feel empty or invisible. In adulthood, this can manifest as a desperate need for validation and admiration, because their sense of self has always depended on external reinforcement. Both of these extremes, criticism on one end and over-idealization on the other, teach a child the same lesson. Love is conditional. Either they must prove themselves through achievements and perfection, or they must maintain a sense of being extraordinary to keep affection. In both cases, the child is denied the experience of being loved simply for existing, for being their authentic self. This is where the roots of narcissistic patterns can form. Children who grow up under conditional love may also develop a distorted view of relationships. They learn that connection is transactional. You give something in order to get something back. Authentic emotional intimacy feels foreign because their early model of love was built on performance, compliance, or status. As adults, they may struggle to trust that others can truly accept them without conditions. They may seek admiration rather than genuine connection because admiration feels safer and more predictable. When parenting is balanced, firm yet loving, structured yet accepting, children thrive. They learn that discipline does not cancel love, and that mistakes are opportunities to grow rather than threats to belonging. But when parenting is inconsistent, overly critical, or excessively idealizing, the child grows with a distorted sense of what love means. They internalize the belief that they are only as good as their last achievement, their last success, or the last moment they made someone proud. The key understanding is that conditional love, whether through neglect, criticism, or even excessive praise, shapes how children perceive themselves and how they will later interact with the world. It plants the seed that self-worth is fragile and dependent on others. Over time, this seed can grow into defensive patterns, exaggerated self-presentation, or relentless striving, traits we often recognize as narcissism. Yet beneath those traits lies a child who once longed for acceptance without conditions and never fully received it. When a child grows up in an environment where their emotional needs are not consistently met, they do not simply stop having those needs. They adapt. They find ways to survive emotionally in a world that may not feel safe, nurturing, or accepting. These adaptations often appear as patterns of behavior and personality that we later call narcissistic traits. To understand this, it is important to see narcissism not as an intentional choice to manipulate or dominate, but first and foremost, as a survival strategy a child develops in order to protect themselves from overwhelming feelings of inadequacy, rejection, or abandonment. Children are highly sensitive to the emotional climate of their home. They notice when warmth is absent, when affection feels conditional, When mistakes are met with harsh criticism, or when achievements are the only currency for attention. Because they cannot control their caregivers, they do the only thing they can. They control themselves. They alter how they express their emotions, what parts of themselves they show, and even how they perceive reality in order to reduce pain and increase the chance of connection. This process is not conscious, but it is powerful. It teaches the child that survival depends on creating a version of themselves that is more acceptable than their authentic self. For example, if a child learns that expressing sadness results in dismissal or ridicule, they may suppress sadness entirely. They might present a mask of strength and resilience, even though inside they are hurting. If they discover that being funny or charming earns them attention, they may exaggerate those qualities to maintain closeness with others. If they see that perfectionism or achievement protects them from criticism, they may overdevelop those tendencies, pushing themselves beyond their natural limits. These strategies are effective in the short term. They keep the child connected to caregivers and reduce the risk of rejection. But they come at the cost of authenticity. Over time, the child begins to confuse the survival self with the real self. They may lose touch with their true feelings because showing those feelings once felt unsafe. They learn to hide vulnerability, to build walls around shame, and to replace authentic self-expression with a carefully curated image. That image might look confident, competent, even superior. But beneath the surface, the original fear of rejection still lingers. The survival strategy becomes a way to keep others at a safe emotional distance, while still securing some form of attention or validation. It is important to recognize that these strategies are not chosen out of selfishness. They are chosen out of necessity. A child cannot survive without some form of connection to their caregivers, even if that connection is flawed. When love feels uncertain, the child does whatever it takes to preserve it. Narcissistic behaviors are often born from this desperation to keep love within reach, even if it means sacrificing their authenticity. The child convinces themselves that the false self is the only safe self, the only self that can guarantee survival. As this pattern solidifies, the child grows into an adult who continues to rely on the same strategies. They may seek admiration, status, or validation, not because they are greedy for attention, but because admiration feels safer than vulnerability. Genuine closeness feels dangerous because in their early experience, showing true feelings often resulted in pain. They may present themselves as grandiose or self-sufficient, not because they truly feel superior, but because superiority is a shield that protects them from the terrifying possibility of being exposed as inadequate. This is why it is more accurate to view narcissism as an adaptation rather than a simple personality flaw. It is an armor that was once necessary, a set of strategies developed when a child had limited options. The tragedy is that what once kept them safe later limits their ability to connect authentically. The survival strategy becomes a prison. It shields them from rejection, but it also keeps them from experiencing the intimacy and acceptance they long for. Understanding narcissistic traits through the lens of survival allows us to see the humanity beneath the behavior. We can recognize that behind the mask is often a frightened child who learned early on that being real was unsafe. Their strategies may create challenges in relationships, but at their root, these strategies are an attempt to manage deep-seated insecurity and fear. Seeing it this way does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does explain how these patterns are born and why they are so difficult to change. When we consider the roots of narcissistic traits, one of the most profound elements to examine is the cycle of unmet needs that begins early in life and often continues throughout adulthood. At the heart of every child is a simple set of emotional needs: the need to be seen, the need to feel safe, and the need to be loved for who they are. These needs are not extravagant or optional. They are essential for healthy development. When those needs are met consistently, a child develops a stable sense of self. But when they go unmet, when a child is overlooked, criticized, idealized, or treated conditionally, the child enters a cycle where their true self never feels validated, and they are forced to create a false self in its place. The cycle often begins with small moments that accumulate over time. A child expresses fear, but the parent dismisses it as weakness. The child shares joy, but the parent is too distracted to notice. The child makes a mistake, but instead of being guided, they are shamed. Each of these moments sends the same message: your feelings are not important. Your authentic self is not welcome. Because the child still depends on the caregiver for survival, they cannot walk away. Instead, they adapt. They learn to silence certain emotions, hide their vulnerabilities, and mold themselves into the version that earns even a sliver of approval. This is the beginning of the false self, a mask that covers the parts of them that feel unsafe to reveal. But here is the tragedy. Even when the false self earns praise or recognition, the child does not feel truly loved. They sense, on some level, that it is the mask that is being admired, not their real self. This creates a painful internal split. On one side is the hidden, authentic child who longs for unconditional love. On the other side is the carefully constructed persona that exists only to win approval. The authentic self remains unmet, unseen, and unvalidated, while the false self becomes the tool for survival. This dynamic becomes cyclical because the more the child relies on the false self, the further away they feel from genuine connection. As the child grows into adolescence and adulthood, the cycle persists. They may continue to chase external validation through achievements, appearance, charm, or status, believing that if they can just gain enough admiration, the emptiness inside will finally be filled. But the emptiness never truly goes away because the original unmet needs have never been addressed. The child who once longed to be loved for simply existing still lives within them. still waiting for the moment of unconditional acceptance that never came. The result is a constant hunger for validation, a search that can never be satisfied because it is aimed at filling a void left by unmet needs in the past. This cycle of unmet needs also influences relationships. Adults who develop narcissistic traits may struggle to connect authentically because deep down they fear that showing their real selves will once again lead to rejection. They may present confidence, charm, or superiority, but underneath is a fragile self that feels unsafe. Relationships become arenas where they seek admiration instead of intimacy, because admiration feels safer and more predictable than vulnerability. Yet admiration cannot provide the genuine nourishment they crave, so the hunger continues, and the cycle repeats. It is important to see that this cycle is not born from malice. It is born from pain. A child did not choose to have their needs unmet, nor did they choose to create a false self. These were adaptations, strategies to protect themselves from the unbearable experience of rejection or neglect. The problem arises because what worked in childhood for survival becomes a barrier in adulthood. The false self that once shielded them now prevents them from experiencing the very thing they most desire: real, unconditional connection. Breaking this cycle is difficult because it requires revisiting the original wounds, acknowledging the unmet needs, and learning to validate the authentic self that was hidden away. This is why so many adults with narcissistic traits struggle to change. The mask feels safer than the vulnerability of exposing the real self. Yet the cycle of unmet needs can only be broken when authenticity is finally allowed to emerge, and when the individual begins to experience that it is possible to be valued not for the mask they wear, but for the person they truly are. Understanding this cycle helps us to see narcissism not just as a personality style, but as a story of a child who longed to be loved without conditions, but instead learned that survival depended on hiding their real self. It is a story of unmet needs that echo across a lifetime, shaping behaviors, relationships, and self-perception. And it is a reminder that behind even the most impenetrable mask is often someone still yearning for the simple human experience of being seen, being accepted, and being loved for who they really are.